2. The reason why atheism is necessary is because it's destructive of the corrupt elements of religion. It gets rid of accusation and protection by exposing why they're flawed. But it doesn't just do that. And that's what, again, where a lot of the new atheists will leave it. It also has a function of liberating individuals toward a faith that's cleansed of those elements. And is self-aware faith, right? Not a naive faith that looks to the preconditions of the critique and embraces those instead, which makes that a new kind of religion. There's been all sorts of writing about how the new atheists are just another version of fundamentalists, and that's a lot of why, right? They don't negate anything. They might negate those elements, but they still profess a certain devotion to a series of fundamental principles that they're unable to look at or see exposed. You know, you'd almost need to have an atheist within the new atheist movement expose what's divine about their atheism, you know, to get them to move towards something like a faith. It just becomes harder, it becomes more secret, and it's less self-aware, less reflective. In that sense, it's almost easier for somebody who's raised in a traditional religious context, which has those notions of accusation and protection very prominent, to move through atheism to arrive at faith. So atheism for Ricœur is always a double movement of destroying what is corrupt and exposing the possibility for something new. Number 3. The double movement, down there, looking backward at what it destroys, forward to what it makes possible, is for Ricœur what opens up the faith for a post-religious age. The prophecies of the end of the demise of religion have been going on for a long, long time. I mean, between Feuerbach or Marx or Freud or Nietzsche. I mean, the notion that God is dead, religion has outlived its usefulness, it's archaic, we don't need it anymore. I mean, that's been a commonplace for 150 or so years. It still hasn't happened, though, right? I mean, the world is grounded in religion, in religious values, in religious devotion. It's a very prominent force. And so the naysayers of religion looked at it from their perspective as something like a, I don't know, what a prehensile tail? Like, what are those parts of the human body that evolution supposedly, the spleen, not the spleen.
Vestigial.
The appendix, yeah, the appendix, right? It doesn't seem to have any great function for us, but we just carry it around. The great critics of religion thought of religion in that way. But there's something more for Ricœur. There's a need for faith, and even if we're moving into a post-religious age, there's still a need for faith, and there's still a need for a self-aware faith that grounds itself in the myths and stories of humankind, that understands itself in light of the earlier fears that it's overcome, but it actually overcomes them in a very intentional way. So that's the double movement. 4, and here's a quote from Ricœur, the period of confusion in which the true consequences of the death of religion perhaps still remain concealed is also the time of long, slow, and indirect preparation. Okay? So what Ricœur sees when he's writing this, and what I think is still true of time today, it's a transition, it's a liminal period, it's a transition time, it's a time of confusion. It's a time when truth is held as something less certain. There are fewer agreed upon values, there are fewer agreed upon ways of understanding what truth might even mean. And all that ushers in a time of confusion. Understanding what the rise of a secular culture might do in terms of that confusion becomes important, right? And it's important because it's not easy for God to die. It's not easy for there to be a death of religion. It's really troubling. There's a lot of people who want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and let everything that was good about religion go as well, and that doesn't work. You know, there are a lot of failed models that try to take out of the confusion something sure, right? To grasp some form of certainty or some measure of control out from the confusion. But what ends up happening is it just replicates the same structure of what's taboo. Well, what's taboo now becomes the religious, right? The refuge becomes science, or the refuge becomes philosophy, or the refuge becomes secularism or technology, or whatever that refuge looks like. And what becomes taboo is the practice of something that looks like superstition or magic or religion, right? It just flips the scales, but it keeps that same structure. It just goes backwards. It reverts. It's not an interesting movement. Rather than have that happen, what Ricœur really wants to do is look at the time of confusion is not a bad thing, right? It's okay to be confused. It's okay to wait patiently in the time of confusion and just let that happen. And instead of rushing toward a new point of certainty or a new horizon of meaning that you grasp onto and control, allow that time of confusion to be a long, slow, and indirect mode of preparation. Any type of direct action out from confusion is generated by fear. And it's that same fear that you're going to screw something up that you don't know about, therefore you need protection, right? I mean, it's the same kinds of fears that religion's intended to answer. And in a lot of ways, this is part of Ricœur's critique of why atheism needs to be a movement through to something else. You can't just start here. You know, at some point, you're going to be driven back to these basic human fears. And you're going to have to check those fears, be skeptical of those fears, purge them of their corrupting elements, and then you get to something else. What that something else is, we can't know right now. We're still confused. The world hasn't changed. You know, God might have died in 1888 when Nietzsche proclaimed it, but we don't know what that means yet. We don't know what to do with that yet. And society is still reeling and trying to grasp back to what's old or what's skeptical rather than looking to something new. And that's in his own way what Ricœur's gently pushing us toward. How to understand what faith might be in a secular or in a post-religious world. And for Ricœur, that's atheism. Make sense? Okay. Let me put it one more way and then I'll move on. Rather than an ending point, what atheism is the point of atheism is to usher in a point of confusion, which is also a point of potential creativity. Right? It's not meant to be a space of conviction, but it's a space where the critiques of atheism also become criticized, right? The skepticism that atheism introduces admits the skepticism to attack its own foundations, and it requires the generation of this kind of confused unworldedness that's pure potentiality. Very little is actually true. Very little accretes or solidifies around it. It's open. And it's radically open in a way that's really, really scary for human beings. But for him, that's the potential of atheism. Not as a resting place, but as a clearinghouse that lets us think through to what's beyond. All right. So for Ricœur, faith emerges out of the dialectic interaction between religion and atheism. Dialectics is a term that's been around for a long, long time. And it posits that there's an initial thesis of something true and an antithesis that comes around to show what's false about that. And it eventually ends up in synthesis between the two positions. That's the quick and dirty version of what dialectics look like. A more nuanced view says that there's a thesis, and it ends up being negated, right? It doesn't work very well. And it's like when you have a door that you're trying to open, and you know it's a door. It's very door-like, right? You can see through it, and it's meant to be a portal. And it keeps not working. And you push, and you push, and you push, and you push, and it keeps not working. The synthesis isn't exactly something new. The synthesis is realizing it's a pull door all along, and you just open it, right? It's a determinate negation. It's a way of negating it that's unlike all the pushes that don't matter. The pull, or the synthesis, is something new that emerges out from the space of destruction. It's a determinate negation. It's a negation of an initial thesis that actually matters, that actually produces something more. And for Ricœur, that's what faith looks like. So the three things on that page that Ricœur talks about in terms of faith. Number one, faith differs from the belief that one finds in religion. Okay? Religion has a certain kind of belief, or a certain kind of what you might call faith, that's anchored within it, right? Most religions orient themselves to what can't be proven, right? It allows for some sort of transcendence, some sort of unknowability that infuses itself with everyday reality to make it more important, more meaningful, bigger, better, right? There are consequences that might not be in this life, but that will be in the life after. And you have a faith or a kind of belief in it that's anchored in what religions teach, right? You have faith that your understanding of what's inside the circle as okay and what's outside of the circle as taboo, you have faith that those kinds of rules and regulations are the right ones. Right? And that requires a certain kind of faith or a certain kind of belief. For Ricœur, the kind of faith that he's interested in, the faith in a post-religious age or in a secular world, is something very, very different. It's only what comes after atheism. It's the forward movement out of atheism. It's how we learn to pull instead of push. That's what faith is. In other words, one ought not to recoil and fall back into a naive acceptance of a religious truth after a confrontation of atheism. Right? If you grow up with some sense of religion, however you want to define what religion means, and you run up against something like an atheism that exposes to you what's corrupt about it, the worst thing to do is to run way back here. I mean, for Ricœur, it's just, I mean, that's not a movement forward, that's just waiting outside the door. You know, you try to push the door, and it doesn't open, and so you just wait for somebody else to come by and open it. And then you end up, I don't know. Kant had the parable of the person from the country sitting outside the door and waiting 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 and then waiting, and then when he was about to die, he still didn't get in. It didn't matter. You know, like for Ricœur, you don't just wait outside the door. You know, that's not an you don't really interact with what's true about atheism at that point. You recoil, and your fear of punishment and your desire for refuge outweigh your pursuit of truth or authenticity. Okay? So rather than doing that, faith is a forward movement out from atheism, instead of your more naive acceptance of this kind of belief that came before atheism. Before a confrontation with atheism, all religious belief is naive. Right? It's the tradition that you grow up accepting. It's stuff that you don't think about. It's the assumptions that color the backdrop or the background of your world. They remain unthought. And you might have a moment like, huh, I wonder if there is no God. That's weird. What a crazy thought. You know, it's along the lines of, I wonder if there's aliens. I don't know. That'd be kind of cool. You know, they might have happenstance, but they're not real. And this remains very naive. Okay? For a true faith to emerge, it has to go through atheism. Number two, distinguishing faith from religion is a difficult task that Ricœur fears is impossible to accomplish fully. I mean, he gets it. What he's pointing toward, this kind of pole faith, or this synthesis that emerges in what he wants to call faith, is really hard to distinguish from what one might call religion. You know, it's not like you enter the Wizard of Oz land and everything's in Technicolor. You're like, oh, this is the truth. I understand it now. Everything's emeraldy and golden. And there's brightness and people singing at me. You know, nothing like that will happen. The problem is that both religion and faith begin something that's never completed. This is a quote from him. Point towards something that's never revealed, and suggest from a distance something that's never made manifest. Right? What ends up coming out here still has a lot to do with religion. Right? It's just religion minus its corrupt parts. So it's going to keep that structure of religion that begins that which isn't completed, points toward what's not revealed, and suggests from a distance what can't be made manifest, right? It's still pointed toward those ineffable, unknowable things. It looks a lot like religion. It just doesn't have these parts anymore, right? But what it removes are those very human parts of fearing punishment, desiring refuge, right? A notion of right and wrong or taboo and okay that really help us orient our lives in meaningful ways. And so without those, what's left is all the hardest parts of religion. And they're even harder after a confrontation with atheism because you don't have the kind of certainty and control that religion affords. Right? It strips out all of those illusions that you can control, that there's a God that you can pray to protect you. It gets rid of all of that, and all you have left is the very hard human fact that you're finite, you're in a dangerous world, a lot of people don't like you, there's a lot of easy ways to die, you might not be important or meaningful, and you're going to persevere anyway. That's scary. And it takes faith, but not this kind. Is that difference making more sense? Becoming more clear? I guess that was number 2. So number 3. Accordingly, what he's looking toward, and again, this whole essay becomes an act of faith, and it becomes an almost futile engagement where he wants himself in the essay to begin toward that which can't be completed. I mean, this isn't the final word on what faith means. It's a fairly short essay, right? I mean, he's not completing it. He's not telling the capital T truth about it. He's just trying to sketch out an orientation toward what isn't being revealed. And that's it. I mean, that's the work of the essay. And as you read through the essay, you'll have those similar frustrations. Like, I don't get it. Like, where's this point of security or certainty that I can hang on? It isn't there. The essay itself is an act of faith. Reading the essay is an act of faith. And my attempt to interpret the essay is also an act of faith. A whole bunch of ways to understand it, and this is just one peculiarly idiosyncratic one that I hope is helpful. But in terms of faith, it becomes, quote, situated beyond accusation and protection. It's free. There's nothing of those things that sticks or belongs to it. And it's removed. The understanding, though, that you can get from Ricœur is that even this mode of faith is still liable to some sort of critique. Right? Like, you can achieve this kind of faith. You can move out through atheism towards something that's beyond protection or accusation, and you can feel pretty good about yourself. You're like, yeah, I'm walking in faith. I got it. I know what that means. And then you'll read something or stumble upon something or hear something that offers a criticism of that. And the tendency, as it was up here, would be to run back toward what you've been practicing as faith all along. Right? The model that you're familiar with, that's become traditional, that you're okay with. But what Ricœur, I think, would ask you to do is to take that critique seriously, but not linger there, right? Not have this new kind of faith become destroyed into this nihilistic abyss of despair. We're like, oh, there's no meaning. There's nothing left. Life is bleak. You know, I have no safety, no comfort, no anything. But to take that critique instead and develop an even stranger and more idiosyncratic sense of faith that's purged of even more elements of accusation and protection that still clung to it. And to even here, not hang on too tightly. To live that faith very, very loosely, so that the next time a critique comes along, you're perhaps maybe even a little more able or more quick to make the next movement forward. But it's always a forward movement through atheism and into something that's more humble, more fallible, and far more human. So that is the essay, or at least page 1 of the essay, and how, at least a working sense of how he defines those 3 terms.